Amen. Well, one Sunday coming out of church, Mrs. Peterson asked her husband, "Do you think that Johnson girl is coloring her hair?" "I didn't even see her," he replied. "And that dress Mrs. Hanson was wearing," continued Mrs. Peterson, "really, don't tell me that you think that's appropriate for a mother of two." "I'm afraid I didn't notice that either, dear," said Mr. Peterson. "Oh, for heaven's sake," snapped Mrs. Peterson, "a lot of good it does you to go to church." And if you like that one, how about this one, my friends? An embarrassed woman approached the pastor after worship one day. "I hope you didn't take it personally, Reverend, when my husband walked out during your sermon," she said. "I did find it rather disconcerting," the preacher replied. "It's not a reflection on you, sir," insisted the churchgoer. "Ralph has been walking in his sleep ever since he was a child." How'd I do, Dan? Oh, Dan's sleeping. Oh, yes, my friends, these are literally the kind of scenarios that my stress dreams are made of, right? For as long as I have held this position here at the Congregational Church of Brookfield, I have had a stress dream every night before I have had to preach a sermon on Sunday morning, right? Which, now with Bryn gone, means, right, that for the last few weeks, things have been really interesting in our house on Saturdays. So these are the kind of dreams you perhaps might remember right before a big exam at school or before a huge deadline at work or, something along those lines where you show up really ill-prepared for something, or even worse, you show up like in your towel right out of the shower, right? My stress dreams, though, are always about worship. Imagine that. Right? It begins with me waking up nearly late enough that I nearly miss being on time in any sense of the word for worship, right? And then the boredom sets in very, very quickly. I look out into all of your faces and I see nothing but blank stares, right? And then, as I begin my sermon, for which I have done absolutely nothing to prepare, by the way, I look out and people are taking out pens and papers and creating grocery lists and napping and balancing your checkbooks and studying for exams and texting and talking with one another, right? And the ultimate, actually getting up and walking out the door, okay? You name it, my friends, and in these dreams, you are all doing it, right? Needless to say that I come in each Sunday a bit apprehensive of what might actually happen, but don't get any ideas, got it? Just sit tight for just a couple of minutes, okay? Well, when I read the scripture from 2 Samuel, right, for this morning, the one that Corey read, I wondered if David actually was kind of caught up in the middle of one of those stress dreams, or just in the middle of a deep and ecstatic moment in his life, right? Because after all, he had just been named king of the combined Israel and Judah, had established a capital in Jerusalem, and now was working to bring the Ark of God, right? What was seen as God's immediate and ultimate dwelling place back to this new and powerful city. And this was a huge job, right? Because the Ark wasn't just one of those things that, you could take on and off the communion table, depending on the decorating needs for worship that day. It was the real deal, right? It was the place that held not only the presence of God, but the awe-inspiring mystery, right? All that was unknown about God as well. I say that thing about the stress dream, though, because you may have caught it. It says that David was dressed in a linen ephod, right? Which basically means that David was dancing before the Lord practically naked, right? And so, but it didn't matter to him, right? And it didn't matter to the other people who were with him, right? They were dancing with reckless abandon before their brothers and sisters in faith and before God, right? After all, he and all of the people who were with him were swept up in this experience, in the worship, and the knowledge that they were the bearers of God in that moment, and the opportunity to bring God to their people and to the world. It was one of those moments, as Mark Twain once wrote, right, in which they were willing to sing like no one's listening, right? Love like you've never been hurt. Dance like nobody's watching, my friends, right? And live like it's heaven on earth. So they played their instruments and they danced, whirling and twirling and praising and realizing in the midst of it all what a serious job it was to be the bearers of the ark, to be the bearers of the mystery, and to do God's work, right? Now, I don't know whether you have ever been caught up in a worship service like this before. I've had the privilege to actually be a part of one of them. And the most vivid memory I have is of this one mission Sunday when I was living in the Dominican Republic, right? And on these particular Sundays, worship lasted literally all day, from 9 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. And so I don't want to ever hear you guys complain that the service goes over an hour again, all right? There were a number of preachers, right, and bands and people from everywhere that were associated both with the Good Samaritan mission and the Maranatha Church in the city of La Romana. And they actually bussed people in from the Bates, the extremely poor villages where the sugarcane cutters and their families were forced to live. And people from the city were there too, so they were worshiping side by side, right? And the most moving moment was the moment when the call to offering actually took place. Slowly at first, and then more quickly, kind of as momentum caught on and people began to rise to their feet, right? And so they stood up. You could kind of see heads popping up one at a time. I was up in the balcony. And then they started to dance in place, right? And I don't know whether you've ever heard really good merengue music before, but I tell you, it gets you moving. And then they started to form this merengue conga line, right? So down all of the aisles of the church go hundreds of people, right? And they were dancing forward with their offerings, right? Doctors next to sugarcane cutters, people who had money next to people who were giving all that they had over to the work of this mission and the work of the church, knowing that the mission would give back to them, right? Would make sure that they survived, that they lived to share the stories of their lives with folks like me who were just passing through for a little bit, right? So that God could be seen at work in their lives and in the works of those who were giving their blood, their sweat, and their tears to make every dollar stretch a million miles to serve the children of God, right? This is worship like nothing you have ever seen before, right? It is amazing and powerful and moving. And I've been in some pretty good worship services in my time, in my line of work. I still get goosebumps when I think about it, though. And as I was writing for this morning, I sat down and I put on some of that music. And it just stirs you, right? It stirs your soul. I think about the challenges that those folks had to overcome, though, in order to make it to worship, and the fullness with which they gave themselves over, right? To share their petitions with God and to be moved by God's Spirit in that place that morning. Now, each year during confirmation class, when we get to the class on worship, right, the first thing we do is we talk about all the challenges that the early Christians first had to face in order to make it to worship, let alone to actually have a service, right? First, they had to secretly identify themselves in some way to one another. After all, if they had been out and open about it, then they could have gotten themselves killed. Then they had to find a safe place to worship. If they were in a town where the movement was gaining ground, then perhaps that could have been in someone's home, but oftentimes it meant going beyond the city limits to a cave or something along those lines. Finally, they had to work hard to figure out a way to spread their message and their beliefs without anyone else finding out who they were unless they wanted to end up in the long list of martyrs. They worshiped at the risk of death, right? They gave all that they had to worship their God. And they did so, right? It wasn't just something that they did because it was the right thing to do or because they would have felt guilty if they didn't show up on Sunday morning or because it was the only thing happening or because their parents forced them to come and sit in the pew, right? They did it because they believed so completely in God at work among them and in the gospel message, right? That good news about mercy and love and forgiveness and what it could mean for their lives that they literally risked it all. It's only at that point, right, then during our confirmation class that I can begin to discuss with our confirmands where it is that our church sits in our geography here in Brookfield, Connecticut, right? And what it looks like, and whether or not people know that we're a church from the outside, which I think people really do, I would say, and whether or not we feel comfortable walking into it in broad daylight on a Sunday morning, right? Perhaps we take for granted the opportunities to do things that people once risked or even to this day continue to risk their lives for. Or don't think it's so much our job to help spread the message like our ancestors in faith did in ways that stretch and challenge us. Perhaps we've tamed our God a little bit too much, right? Able to believe that God is present with us, but really working, we're not so sure about that, right? Through the joys and concerns God is working in our lives. That is at times a bit harder to fess up to or to swallow, maybe. There's this great quote from Annie Dillard, and she said this about worship, right? Does anyone have the foggiest idea of what sort of power we so blithely invoke as we gather for worship on Sunday mornings? Or as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it, right? It is madness to wear ladies' straw and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets, right? Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares, and they should just lash us to our pews to make sure that we can hang on for the ride, right? The power of God, my friends. There is some pretty serious stuff that God is at work doing in our lives. And now maybe I don't really want to know the answer to this question, so this may be the one moment in time when I want you to look like you're totally bored and nothing is going on in your minds. Okay, ready? Here we go. But have you ever had a Sunday, right, when God's presence was so palpable and God's voice was so clear and present to you that you felt like you perhaps could have used a life preserver instead of your Sunday best, right? I've had some of you walk by me on Sunday mornings, and I've had you all say, wow, something happened in there, right? Those are those moments when you knew that God was not only enfolding you and surrounding you with grace, but also challenging you to move, to be, to do. What a tremendous blessing that is when we can have those moments in this place, and what a great responsibility it is as well. The truth is that we all carry with us into these worship spaces the things of our outside lives, right? Sometimes those things are naturally cause for joy. People getting married or finding a job after a long search or having a child recovering from an injury or a serious illness and getting back on track after battling an addiction or just having spent some quality time with some good family and some good friends. Other times, though, those things are the things that cause us concern, right? Children who are ill and new and difficult diagnoses and money issues and being torn away from family and friends and losing jobs, feeling lost and alone. A few years back, we did this adult study on the book Transforming Congregational Culture by Tony Robinson. I don't know how many of you were able to participate in that and read it. But we do a lot of asking in church, and we do a lot of giving, right? Giving of our time and our talents and our treasures. But what Tony Robinson invites us to do is to think about the ways that we can be receivers who give, right? To think about the places in our lives where we need God to break in and shake things up a little bit, or to break in and to heal us, to realize that we need God's grace, that we need moments when we can feel God palpably inside us doing something and working inside us. And through the joy that we feel when we know that, then we are able to give, right? I have found myself saying to many people here in this space that if there's one place where all of those things can meet, right? The joys of our lives and the concerns of our lives and the world, and where we can be truly our whole selves and share our true selves, all of our emotions, everything, right? Complete with smiles and laughter and anger and tears, then this should be the place, right? Not many people can do that in their offices or in their homes, but here we should be able to do that. We should be able to share those things. Because as the author of Ephesians wrote all those years ago, despite everything, we are all beloved by God, right? All a part of God's mysterious plan for the kingdom, all adopted in love to be a part of this great big family, the family of God's children, called to be open to God's Spirit and to care for one another in this place and beyond these walls as well. There have been times in my life of deep pain when I have wept, but there have also been times of tremendous joy when I have been moved to tears, right? Too much inside that just needs to get out and does it in any way you can. And I've watched some people here on Sunday mornings kind of try and wipe away the tears, right? This is the place where they can come out, right? Can you imagine what our worship would be like, right, if that was the case all the time, right? Not if we were all a big, blubbery, slobbery mess. Maybe that would not be so appealing to anyone. But some of you can be. Go ahead. It's okay. But if we were all so joy-filled with our knowledge of God and God's presence with us, despite or perhaps because of the prayers that are weighing on our hearts, and awe-filled by all that still remains to be known about our amazingly powerful God, that we couldn't help but let it all out, right? And not just in here, but out there, spreading the message of God's love and acceptance and challenge and call. So I leave you with the question that is the title for this sermon today, my friends. Despite all the baggage and all of the things that keep us guarded in our New England little lives here, as we come to worship this Sunday or any Sunday, are we joyful? Are we joy-filled or what? Right? Perhaps the answer will be different for you each week, but my hope is that we will at least consider the question. Consider the source, right? The one in whom we live and move and have our very being. And we'll be willing to stretch ourselves a bit to consider worship as the act that, even when it seems to be breaking, sheltered by God's mysterious and never-ending love, comes from a truly joyful heart. Amen.